Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I want to share a heartwarming and thought-provoking story about an unusual friendship that unfolds in the early morning light. Meet George, a young seagull with a unique spirit who defies the norms of his kind. While most seagulls enjoy peaceful afternoons by the sea, George wakes up before dawn to join a different crowd, vultures. Why does he do this? What does it mean to find belonging in unexpected places? Let's dive into this beautiful tale of identity, belonging, and the surprising connections we form along the way. So grab your coffee, get comfy, and let's explore the world through George's eyes. George, crazy bird, I thought, as I always do when I see them in the morning. I waved good morning and went on to write. I couldn't stop thinking about that unusual friendship. George would cry out at 5, sometimes at 4:30 in the morning. But I'm getting ahead of myself. George didn't always cry out. He learned to mingle in its way. George was young and would land on the old streetlight pole in the morning with his friends or adoptive relatives. Actually, to this day, I don't know if he was adopted or even accepted. And honestly, I don't think George ever had a mirror or felt like he belonged. George, a bird of the sea, a seagull of sunset afternoons, didn't follow the system. Oh no. George would wake up early and scavenge for food with those who weren't really his own, but whom he adopted, or maybe he tried to be adopted. He was young, that much I know. When he started hanging out with the crowd that gets up early to clean food out of the street trash, making an even bigger mess for those who actually come to clean the streets, they never noticed George either. He'd show up an hour earlier with his crew, sit with them, scavenge for food with them, fly with them, walk the streets with them. Or hop. I believe I saw him hopping just like his partner birds. George rebelled against the system. I'm sure of it. Instead of the peaceful sunset afternoons with abundant food like the ocean, he preferred to join the early risers who clean up the trash at 5 in the morning. He was young, flying near them, watching. One by one, they'd leave, and George would follow. I'd never seen a seagull on a rooftop, but George would go if called. Or maybe he wasn't even called, but how would I know? George is a seagull that hangs out with vultures. Nothing against vultures, they have their environmental, social role, waking up early to work. Even if they didn't, I'm not a fan of that. Ew, vultures! Talk. They're birds just like any other. And if you need function, utility, a reason to fly around, theirs is obvious, and George understood that. As he got older, George started to cry out in the morning. He'd meet his crew on top of the poles, descend to the asphalt, and get to work. He'd eat and fight to finish his meal. George grew up, never giving up on hanging out with the vultures, even though they often ignored him. They still ignore him sometimes. They're not wrong. They don't understand the interest of this different bird they see from afar, who looks just like those with the privilege of wandering around unbothered in the peaceful afternoons of sunset. What's interesting is that George never gave up on them. He came back and still returns every day to be part of the group's routine. Maybe George just preferred a big flock rather than flying solo. Or perhaps he understood the beauty of belonging to more than one place. Maybe he liked the simple things, like the way they walked, but I doubt that. George wanted to belong. I wonder if a vulture could ever choose to be a seagull, dive into the ocean, sit on the sand at the end of the day. Probably not. Not because of the seagulls, but because few of us would ever see the beauty in vultures the way George did. Sometimes, as I walk through the city during the day, I see whirlwinds of vultures calmly enjoying the strong winds. They spin peacefully as if they're taking in the end of the day, even though it's still daylight. I always spot that white dot and know it's George, the seagull who chose to wake up at 5, sometimes 4:30. Thanks for joining me on this journey into George's world. Bird Sparkles' his story reminds us that belonging isn't always about fitting in. Sometimes, it's about embracing our unique paths and the friendships we forge along the way. Whether we're seagulls, vultures, or anything in between, we all have something valuable to offer and learn from each other. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of George's choice to hang out with vultures? Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember, true friendship knows no boundaries. See you soon!